Hello, this is class 19, week 19, St. Augustine of Hippo. Before I do anything else, I just thought as I was walking up the stairs, this is the top floor of my house. Um, Augustine or Augustine. In Latin, uh, accent is recessive unless there are some other things going on, which I won't bother you with because you're not a Latin class. But it goes back to the third syllable from the end if there's nothing holding it back. And so if you're speaking English, Augustine, because that's the third to the end. But if you're speaking Latin, it's Augustinus, because there's an us on the end. So if you're Roman Catholics tend to do Augustine because they're thinking of Latin, and Anglicans tend to do Augustine because they're thinking of English. Depending on what you're thinking of, both of them are correct. And depending on what you're thinking of, both of them are wrong, depending on how you're trying to do it. I used to say Augustine when I was young, and then when I was getting my doctoral degree at a Roman Catholic institution, I spent enough time with people who say Augustine, so now I say Augustine. But anyway, that's why. So I've actually had someone ask me that once at a church because it was St. Augustine came around and I talked about him, because you're supposed to talk about the saints of the day. And I talked about him, and then someone afterwards said, I thought that was pronounced Augustine. So you never know. People will ask you everything. Augustine Augustine is the most important author in the development of Latin language Christianity, I would say, in terms of thought and practice. There are important ways in which Augustine is more central to the culture of Latin language Christianity than he is to the theology of Latin language Christianity. We'll talk about this as we go along. There are important ways in which the culture in which we live was convinced by Augustine when the church was not, so that the culture, Latin Christian culture, actually holds a number of Augustinian ideas that the church does not hold and never has held. Augustine is both the great answer man for Latin language Christianity and also in some ways the great creator of problems. A lot of the difficulties that Latin Western Christians have, were created by St. Augustine's own particular biography and do not exist in Eastern and what we now call Oriental forms of Christianity. So he has also been tremendously important in distinguishing Latin Christianity from Greek Christianity. For most of the patristic period, you will notice we've been spending our time in the Greek world. For most of the patristic period, for all of the patristic period, the real theology is done in Greek, not in Latin. Latin people are secondary and mostly not involved. Augustine has had almost no influence on the Greek church at all. He was never been influential there, never been widely read. I believe at some point, well, certainly at some point, a number of his works have been translated into languages that the Easterners use. Church Slavonic or Russian, for example. And certainly there have been a lot of Russian scholars who've read Latin. So Augustine has been read by Eastern Orthodox people at different times in history, but he has no presence there in their theology. And as a matter of fact, in Eastern Orthodox imagination exists as kind of a bogeyman, the guy who holds all of the wrong Eastern ideas, all of the wrong Western ideas that make them wrong and us right. So we'll talk about some of these things as we go along. It is, of course, Augustine wrote an immense library of stuff, almost all of which survives, not all of which survives. We do know a few things we're missing, and there are things that we don't know that we're missing. In one of the most interesting stories to do with the study of the early church, in the 1980s, a Eastern European scholar whose name was Divjak, Divjak, and I can never remember what country he was from, was in the Marseille Public Library in France, at the time of the French Revolution, when the people took over and overthrew the church, they, in a lot of places, they destroyed churches and burned the libraries, but in a lot of places, they took possession of them and took them into the possession of the people. In Marseille, there had been a very important monastery off the coast on an island since the 300s. It's actually the monastery that John Cassian, whom we talked about last, when we did monasticism 2 weeks ago, it was John Cassian's monastery. It went all the way back to there. Their library went all the way back to there, with manuscripts, of course, long before printed books. And that library was taken possession of by the city of Marseille, and it was given to the people, which means they put it in the public library. In the 1980s, Professor Divjak was poking around in the stacks of the Marseille Public Library and discovered, among other things, a manuscript of some letters of St. Augustine that were completely unknown, had been unimagined before. The most interesting thing about what are now called, of course, the Divjak letters, is that which have now been translated in a single volume of the Fathers of the Church series from Catholic University, so you can buy them in English with a very good introduction and explanation of all this stuff. One of the most interesting things about this is that people have, with Augustine being the one who puts forward the Western idea of original sin, again, which the church never fully bought into, but which the culture did buy into, of babies being born guilty at birth, and sex being a way that this is passed along, so therefore sex is in some way a source of evil, and which is not an idea which is inherent to Christianity, and not an idea that other parts of Christianity have ever imagined entertaining. And the Western Church in the end didn't entertain it, but since Augustine said it, he sort of convinced the culture of it, even though the church rejected it. So you hear it from people in the backs of churches, both Protestant and Catholic, all these ideas which are not church doctrine, but which are Augustinian ideas. One of the things which is very interesting about that whole idea is that Augustine, in his works that have been known all along, says that this is a result of the fall, and one of the results of the fall is the lack of control that human beings have over their bodies, which is why we yearn for things we shouldn't have, and we have impure thoughts when we're not trying to. All this, we sort of war with our bodies, and that this is a result of the fall. And professors reading Augustine had always said that, well, if he were consistent, then this would mean that he would imagine that, in the Garden of Eden before the fall, that Adam and Eve, particularly Adam, because of course he's imagining these things as a man, that Adam would have had control over his physical self to a degree higher than we now have, than other human beings have ever experienced, because it was before the fall. And one of the Divjak letters actually talks about this and actually says exactly what all the professors said it ought to say if Augustine was going to be consistent. So it's a remarkable case of scholars being able to put forth a hypothesis and actually have it be tested and proven correct. So Augustinian scholars, whom you see everywhere, of course, are patting themselves on the back extensively ever since the middle 1980s. They're a pretty tough lot anyway. So Augustine studies is a huge subset of patristic studies. Many of them, in my experience, tend to be either French or Italian, and they get very worked up about everything. And I have read what has seemed to me like a lot of Augustine over the years, but nowhere near what there is. And these people, have it all by heart, and they love to fight with each other in public, which makes conferences much more exciting than they would be otherwise. So, we can all benefit from this. So let's go through Augustine, and then the selections that I really chose because I thought they illustrated things that Hall talks about. We can't really do very much with his theology because his theology is very diffuse. Let me say again that something that I think I said when I talked about Origen way back, and that I should have said again when I talked about John Chrysostom, who was someone else who left an ocean of stuff, and also St. Augustine. It's true. Um, all of these people wrote what you could call treatises, organized literary works that were arguing for a particular theological point of view, and like Augustine's work on the Trinity, or Augustine's work, The City of God, big fat things. Um, and those are the works, excuse me, those are the works that people always look to and think of when they're thinking about what does Augustine teach or what does Augustine say. And the same is true with Origen, like with his book on First Principles, which is one of the books we saw that last week, in the Origenism thing, one of the books that got him in trouble, which may actually be the earliest thing that he wrote. People look to something like that and they say, this is what Origen thought. Anyone who's done any work with these people knows that for all of them, for all these, writing a whole library guys, that's not either accurate or fair. If you want to know what Augustine thinks about something, you really need to read his homilies. All of these people, I've said before, the ancient period, both Latin and Greek, had already developed very efficient forms of shorthand, so that trained scribes, who of course were mostly slaves, right? Trained scribes were able to take down human speech as quickly as it is normally spoken. And the reason why we have so many hundred sermons by Origen and Chrysostom and Augustine, those three examples, is that we know that there were very wealthy Christian individuals who were deeply devoted to these people as teachers, and who, while themselves also attending a lot of these services, sent their scribes to take down these sermons in notation and then write them out, in full speech later. Most of the material that we have from Origen, Chrysostom, and Augustine was never written by them, and may also have never actually even been seen by them in written form. They were the common thing in the ancient period, as far as we can tell, and we don't know because we don't have records of everywhere, and it's true that practice seems to vary from place to place, but in a relatively big place with a bishop and a cathedral, when the church can function openly, they're not going to get arrested, stuff like that. The normal thing would be the bishop is the teacher par excellence, the preacher par excellence, and the normal thing to do would, for 6 days a week, there to be a midday service at which the bishop would preach, sitting in his chair, right, ex cathedra. He would preach, and in some of these places this would be Eucharistic, in some of these places it would be, what we would call an office service, just prayers. And then on Sunday it would be a more organized address, generally a longer sermon, prepared. But most of the bishop's preaching was done during the week at these services extemporaneously. A lot of the, Chrysostom's commentary on Romans, for example, is a collection of these weekday extemporaneous sermons. I mean, they're extemporaneous in the sense that they were never written down and they seem not to have been delivered with notes. He would say, okay, now I'm going to do Romans, like one of these Baptist preachers in Texas. I know that Canon Rodier's grandfather, I think, was a fundamentalist preacher who worked his way through the whole Bible. And that's actually a very patristic thing to do. You just say, okay, where do we get to last time, and pick up from there. And of course you're studying scripture all the time, but you don't have it written down or anything. You just look at what's there and you pick up where you left off. By putting these homilies together, you get Chrysostom's commentary on Romans, but it's not a commentary in the sense that even someone like Calvin would write a commentary on something. Calvin's in the period of books being printed. And so the idea that you would produce something in a written form for mass distribution, Luther's the first person who does that in the West, um, that revolutionizes the whole idea of what a commentary is. Before that, commentaries, most of the ones that we have from the early church were pieced together from these homilies, and they were not intended necessarily by the preacher of them to be more widely distributed than the audience that's sitting there. I mean, it's a wonderful blessing for the church that these things survive, but you shouldn't think when you read, Chrysostom on Romans. I keep referring to that because that's a very famous one. When you read Chrysostom on Romans, you shouldn't think that he's imagining, us in the New World reading it, because he's just not. All of this is a long way of saying, if you really want to know what these people thought and what they really taught, you have to read their homilies. The homilies of Origen, the homilies of Chrysostom, the homilies of Augustine are very different from these sort of highfalutin treatises. They're much more accessible. They're actually very good for lay people to read. They're very practical. They're very biblical, of course. They're working through Scripture. They're very accessible. These things have generally been translated into English at this point, and that's one of the. I'm sending you a book list along with this, and one of the things is a note at the top. The New City Press in Brooklyn, New York, is in the process of, they must be getting pretty close to the end, of publishing a complete translation, a new translation of all of Augustine's works. And this is a place where you can get not only the treatises, and not even the organized, homilies in big sets, but just homilies that he gave, which are called the numbered homilies because they're just numbered rather than, being on Romans or something like that. Augustine was doing this kind of stuff all the time. I mean, one of the things to know about Augustine is that he produced 3 works on Genesis, for example, 2 of which are, I think, on the literal meaning of Genesis is the one which is complete. I think 2 of them are unfinished. He kept starting stuff, and then people would, he would be involved in controversy and have to write something about the Donatists, and then he'd come back and. He wrote a complete commentary on the Psalms, which is complete and survives and is the Psalms themselves being the longest book in the Bible and full of material, and of course the Psalms being interesting to Christians because they use them all the time in the offices, all the time in the prayers. He created this massive commentary on the Psalter, which survives and which is now in English. I think the New City Press has done all of that. It's a big thing. Those are wonderful, accessible works, and you can get to know the man much better by reading those than by sitting down and reading his book on the Trinity, which is in some ways his least successful theological work, though it is, of course, perhaps his most famous theological work if you don't count the Confessions as theological. And it's been in some ways influential on sort of academic theologians, but as Hall mentions, and as pretty much every patristic scholar I've ever read or spoken to would say, it's a failure. His book on the Trinity fails as a theology of the Trinity. He has better Trinitarian stuff in the homilies than he does in the book on the Trinity, which is just something he kind of works on in his spare time. But that's almost 20 minutes of that. So let's begin with Hall here, and let me say a few things about this as we go along. Augustine is from a small town outside a small city in Roman Africa. We don't really know. His mother whose name is usually in the professional literature spelled with 2 N's, Monica with 2 N's. Monica seems to be an African name. I've seen a modern Italian movie of Augustine's life in which he's played by a black African person, which is almost certainly wrong. If he was of African descent, he would have been Berber, and so he would have looked very different than a black African. But it's possible that he was racially mixed. We don't know. They didn't feel about that the way we do. Um, he was from a family that was, fancy enough to get him educated, but no big, not a big deal even in, his little part of Africa, let alone in the empire as a whole. He is definitely someone who makes his way in the world as a professional scholar and academic, an orator. Um, as Hall says, he teaches in Carthage, which is of course the biggest city in Africa. Then he teaches in Rome, and then he makes his way to Milan, which really is the, Hall says, which was virtually the capital of the West. Milan was the capital of the West. At that point, it's where the emperor lived. It's where all the government was. Rome was a museum at this point, as far as the government was concerned. And he makes his way all the way to Milan as a professional orator. So he has a position there which gives him social and cultural prominence. This is something we'll come back to. It's one of the things we see. Well, here, let me talk about that now. When he gets to, before he leaves Africa, he gets involved with Manichaeism, which comes from the Parthian Empire. Mani is one of the first we know of many people who thinks that he's Jesus Christ come again, among other things. Manichaeism is very much plugged into the dualist tradition that comes out of Zoroastrianism, which is the traditional Persian religion, viewing all of creation as being controlled essentially by this fight between light and dark, good and evil, which is going on every level, on the human level, below the human level, but all the way up to the highest level too. Augustine is a Manichae for a very long part of his adult life, close to 20 years. There are people who argue that Augustine never really gets over his Manichaeism. He never really gets over his dualism. And I wouldn't like to, as one Christian of another, I wouldn't like to say that. But there are good reasons for saying it. There certainly are hints that Augustine never really gets past that. From that we learn two things. The first is Augustine's basic concern is ethical. He wants to live a good life, and he's concerned about what is good and what is evil. That's what's basically going on in Augustine's head and with Augustine. He's always worried about right and wrong. That's important to remember. And his experience of this personally controls his philosophy and theology. So it's very important to understand that he experiences the effort of trying to live a good life as a tremendous struggle that never seems to go away. He's a tremendously morally serious person, always, before he's converted to Christianity and afterwards. And that's also very important to understand. Any of you who are clergy and hear confessions know that one of the things you have to learn when you hear confessions is to distinguish things the person feels bad about from things that are actually sins, because there is a difference. One of the things to think of as far as this goes is Augustine, for a very long part of his adult life, lives with a common law wife, what we would call a concubine. This is not only a perfectly respectable, it's also a legal relationship. He has a child whom he names Adeodatus, a son given by God. Right? It's the Latin, the Hebrew form of that is Jonathan. Right? So it's a kind of a religious name. Right? Even though he's not a Christian yet when Adeodatus is born. Adeodatus dies either in his late teens or early 20s, and Augustine's very sad about it. But Augustine has this relationship for a very long time, which is a kind of marriage that is recognized in their culture. There are a number of different kinds of marriages in Roman law, and they're all respectable and they're all legal. Later, as a Christian looking back, Augustine sees this as his wallowing in sin and fornication, all this kind of stuff, which I I don't think it is. Um, First of all, at this point, Christians are not being married in church. If they want to do anything after they're married, culturally, or we would say civilly, right? They would come to the church and have the priest say a prayer over them as a married couple. It's not the case that Augustine, if he'd been doing what he should have done, would have gone, marry her in church and, make an honest woman of her. He'd already made an honest woman of her before. He was in a perfectly respectable relationship. Looking back, with his idea that this is all wrapped up with his idea about sin and his idea about the good and evil being this constant struggle you can never get over, and also his idea about sexual activity and sexual relations being one of the places where sin is passed along and where sin resides. All of that is playing in this, and there are experts of Augustine who say that this whole side of his personality and of his personal history is what messes up Latin Christianity in a way that it's never gotten over. And you can make a very good case for that. Certainly the way Latin Christians place sexual sins in the sort of spectrum of sins is different from the way non-Latin Christians do and always have, and some of this seems to come from a lot. I would say a lot of this seems to come from Augustine. So anyway, he's in this relationship and he's got a kid and he goes to Milan, and he's a professional orator. And he's someone who's, he's come to the capital city. He's going to be a person of consequence. He's going to come in contact with the court because of who he is. They will hear him speak, orate on secular subjects and political subjects. And so he goes to hear the greatest speaker in Milan at the time, who is Ambrose, the Catholic Bishop of Milan. At this point, the emperor is an Arian, but Ambrose is Ambrose is trying to relate to him in a sort of hostile, non-hostile way at the same time that Augustine is listening to Ambrose preach. Augustine is brought into the church by Ambrose. Ambrose, first of all, offers him an example of a highly educated, very successful man. He had been the governor of a province before he became Bishop of Milan. A highly successful, upper-class man who is able to take Christianity seriously on an intellectual level. Some of Augustine's problems seem to have been an inability to take Christianity seriously on an intellectual level. The scripture is very bad Latin. That's a real problem. That's a real problem for high culture people like Augustine. Ambrose helps him get around that. He has real trouble with the sort of gaminess of the Old Testament and the anthropomorphic images used of God in the Old Testament. God having wings and hands and all this kind of stuff, walking in the garden in the cool of the day. We don't even notice that stuff because we've been so trained to read these things metaphorically and spiritually. But for someone like Augustine, whose mother was the fervent Christian in the family, and his mother seems to have had virtually no education and to have been very much a literalist Roman African Christian, Augustine's really turned off by all this stuff. He loves his mother and he respects his mother, but he can't take her seriously on an intellectual level, and because of that, he has trouble taking Christianity seriously on an intellectual level. So Augustine is converted in about 3 different ways at the same time and is baptized in Milan by Ambrose. You can go under the cathedral in Milan to the Scavi, the excavations beneath, and see the baptismal font where Ambrose baptized Augustine. I saw it 2 years ago. Took my kids down to see it. I haven't noticed any big effect yet, but I planted a good seed. So anyway, and Augustine returns to Africa, first to a life of sort of philosophical contemplation. He's in his 30s at this point, and eventually gets drawn, as as Gregory Nazianzus does and as John Chrysostom does, a lot of these people, he gets drawn into the clergy against his will and ends up being a bishop for 30 plus years. So, anyway, that's how he ends up being the Bishop of Hippo. What in there are three main controversies that cause him to produce a lot of his written work, and that therefore shape his legacy in the church, which is mostly a written legacy. The first is with Manichaeism. So that's an argument over dualism and, of course, the goodness of creation, which is something that Christianity has always taught, and the Bible teaches very clearly. God looked at what he had done and saw that it was good. Behold, it was very good. Right? Some people question whether or not Augustine ever really came over to that idea, but he argues that point against the Manichees, and then against the Donatists, who are rigorists, who don't want to have anything to do with the Catholic Church because they were too willing to take people back into the church after the Diocletianic persecutions in the early 300s, right before legalization, late 200s, early 300s. And then the last one is with Pelagius over grace and free will. So we have an argument over creation and the goodness of creation, and then we have an argument over the sacraments of the church and the character of the church, and then we have an argument over grace and free will and the freedom of humans to act or not act, with God helping them or without God helping them, or only after God has made them do it, and all of those nature, grace and free will questions that continue to tie Latin Christians into knots. There are still American professors at seminaries and colleges in North America who are losing their jobs in relatively large numbers because they have inappropriately expressed ideas about the relationship between human choice and the grace of God, the prevenient grace of God, or the all these different words that have built up. That all comes from Augustine. There's none of this in Greek and farther Eastern Orthodox Christianities. None of these arguments are not necessary or natural parts of Christianity or a Christian way of looking at the world. That's a tremendously important thing to know. It's different from saying that the question of grace is not an interesting or important question, but you can have an entire Christian tradition like the Greek tradition where you never line people up against the wall and shoot them because they have bad ideas of grace, which happens to people in the Reformation and since, metaphorically and really. Okay, so Augustine, that's why Gerald Bonner's book on Augustine, which will be on your list, is called, one of its subtitles is Controversies. I can't remember what it's called. Augustine something in Controversies. Anyway, there are too many controversies in books that I see, so I can't remember how that one works. But to see St. Augustine as a creature of controversy is natural, because he did spend a huge amount of his time and effort doing those things. It always seems to have been not what he wanted to do, and that's worth knowing too. He was in some ways a very combative person, but I don't think he wanted to be a combative person. I think he was drawn into it. If you read some of those numbered homilies that are not part of these series, you get a sense of a very pastoral, spiritual mind who is trying very hard to be a good Christian and teaching other people how to live in the presence of God, which is, what I would like my kids to have when they go to church. Vandermeer's book, Augustine the Bishop, which is about him as a pastor, even though it's 50 years old, is a very good book to read. That side of Augustine as a pastor is something that, because he's always used to teach doctrine, and because he's always used as the beginning of a course, you begin with Augustine, and then you end up with the Reformation, or you begin with Augustine, and then you end up with what's really gone wrong with the Baptists in Alabama since 1948. That's the way people use Augustine when they teach, or you use Augustine and you end up with Vatican II. There's a lot of Augustine in the church documents in Vatican II. I used to teach a course where I didn't start with Augustine, but there was a big bit of Augustine in there, and then we ended up at Vatican II. That's the way people use Augustine, and it's not false because you're really reading Augustine, but it's very misleading because you're reading him as if that's sort of what he was really about, and I don't think he was. So I'm trying to argue in all of this that I find St. Augustine very uncongenial. His Confessions, which reduces many people to tears, and is the book that they have, on their bedside table, and the book that they ask to be buried with, all that. I find the Confessions impenetrable. I've read them a number of times and never enjoyed it. He doesn't speak to me. I've read, the whole City of God, on Trinity. Some of his books I really like, because of course he wrote, a million. So some of them I really like. But generally as a person, he's not the guy that I turn to if I'm not forced to by circumstance. And yet I do think that if you look at him fairly, he's a very admirable, spiritually minded, right-intentioned exhorter of Christians to try to live lives in the presence of God. And I can't think of anything better to say about anybody who's a teacher in the church. So, but I think you have to look past. Don't go to Barnes & Noble and buy On the Trinity or The City of God or something like that and sit down to read it and think, oh, now I know Augustine. Because first of all, you're torturing yourself, but also you're misleading yourself. There are other ways to get at him. Read a biography of him first before you do anything else. Okay, so let's begin now with these things. Just as a note, I'm now on selection 161 on page 239 in Creeds, Councils, and Controversies. It is a very weird thing, to my mind, that Augustine, who wrote an entire library of stuff, we have almost all of his stuff, but there are a few things that are missing, and who knows, maybe we'll find more. But he has been incalculably influential in the Latin cultural tradition as well as the Latin Christian tradition. And Augustine is very clear in the Confessions that he reads Cicero's dialogue, philosophical dialogue, Hortensius, which is an exhortation to lead the philosophical life, right? This dialogue. And that this really changes him from being a career-minded guy, I want to go as far as I can with oratory stuff, to being someone who says, I want to really lead a good life and be a philosopher, think about what I'm doing and try to do the right thing. And the Hortensius is lost. Cicero, who is, maybe Cicero and Augustine are the two most culturally influential people in the Latin, in the Latin cultural stream. The only work I know of Cicero that's lost is the Hortensius. There may be some other things that are mentioned, but the only named work that I can think of now by Cicero that we don't have is the Hortensius, and it's the work that St. Augustine says changed his life. And Augustine is the only person more influential than Cicero. So the question I've always asked myself is, how could that work ever be lost? When Cicero's works are being used for teaching little schoolboys, torturing little schoolboys from during Cicero's lifetime up to the present day, and Augustine's works have been used for the same thing from during his lifetime up to the present day, how in this situation could the Hortensius be lost is unimaginable to me. Because I would think, as someone who teaches this kind of stuff, I would think that everybody who's got the time would have wanted to start by having his students read the Hortensius and then start on Augustine. And we can't because it's lost. So I offer that as that really is something worth thinking about, because if you imagine how these things actually work, it's very difficult to imagine how that could possibly happen. It shows that there always are things that are unexplainable that are going on in these things. This selection I included because it's interesting in that he talks a little bit about the difficulties he has taking Scripture seriously here in paragraph 5.9 on page 240. His soul, his swelling pride shrank from the lowliness of the Scriptures. We who get our Bible from King James and it comes to us as high literature, that's something that we just can't understand. But for Latin and Greek Christians, all through this early period, one of the biggest problems was that the Bible was so lowbrow in literary terms. That was something that hundreds of years of Christians fought with, and it demonstrably made it more difficult to convert people of higher cultural levels. One of the things to realize you're seeing when you get to Augustine and Ambrose, who was Ambrose is someone we could easily spend a whole week on in a class like this, and that's up to Hall, and we didn't do it, but Ambrose and Augustine are an important part of the wedge that moves Latin-speaking Christianity into the area of high culture. Before that, it just hadn't been there. And it's important to understand that that's only about one generation. Rome falls while Augustine is the bishop in Hippo. That's what the city of God is about. And the Roman Empire pretty much comes to pieces in the West one generation after Augustine. So it only barely penetrates the highest level of society and before the whole thing comes down. It took a very long time for that to happen. Okay, Augustine and Ambrose here, 163. You get this description of how he talks about Ambrose and showing him a philosophical and cultured man, beautifully speaking, able to read Greek literature, which Augustine never really could do, and showing you that you could be an important, highly cultured figure in society and publicly take Christianity seriously, intellectually. And that's very important. It's also important, number 164, I wanted to include Marius Victorinus, who was a tremendously important and respected orator at the same time, who converts publicly to Christianity when he's at the height of his oratorical career. He's in Rome. There is a volume of Marius Victorinus in the Fathers of the Church collection. You can read some of his stuff on the Trinity. Marius Victorinus is also very important in sort of convincing or showing Augustine an example of someone who takes Christianity seriously despite the fact that he himself is a very cultured, publicly cultured, professionally cultured guy. There's no real modern equivalent for an orator, a late Roman orator, in sort of cultural location. It's a little bit like being a combination of Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist, and the woman who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. If you sort of can put those two people together who are very different, and imagine someone who had sort of both that kinds of credibility, and maybe with a touch of Hugh Jackman, because they were performers too, and girls went and swooned over them when they did their beautiful Latin oratory. So if you could put those three things together, from that kind of pinnacle of culture, both popular and fancy, to have someone like that join the church publicly is a very big thing. And so Marius Victorinus is someone who's been completely overshadowed by Ambrose and Augustine, but for them was a very important figure, and he's worth thinking of. That gets us to the conversion of Augustine in the garden. Tolle lege, tolle lege, tolle lege is what the little kids are chanting. My professor, so I say it's like the things that little girls do when they skip rope. It's a sort of rhyming rhythmic chant that you do while you do it. Take and read, take and read, take and read. And so he picks up the Bible and opens it to a random passage, and it's sort of his moment of. It's not really his moment of conversion. It's his moment of admitting to himself that he's converted. And then he begins to act on it. That's one of the great scenes in Western literature, so I didn't want to skip over it. And that's a good thing to mention always. Augustine and the Donatists we get to in 168. The Donatists, one of the things that Augustine does, this is from Posidius's Life of St. Augustine. I put that, which is translated in English, and I put it on your bibliography you're going to get. Posidius is very good because he's an eyewitness. He knew Augustine. And one of the things which is important to Posidius, and so therefore we should take note of, is the fact that Augustine works very hard to debate the Manichees and the Donatists and the Pelagians publicly. He writes against them, but he will also sit down in one of these dialogue things where there's the Donatist bishop and Augustine, and they talk back and forth and ask each other tough questions, what presidential debates are supposed to be but never are, where they actually confront each other, right? And in every case, first Manichees, then Donatists, then Pelagians. After a few times of dealing with Augustine, they don't want to meet him anymore because he makes them look silly in public. So that's when Augustine really kicks in the writing and begins to write treatises against these people. This is clearly an important fact in the actual, in determining the actual success of what he's trying to do. Let me remind you again that as far as we can tell, in Roman North Africa, the vast majority of people were Donatist, not what we would call Catholic, and that this is true all the way up to the Visigothic conquest, the Vandal conquest of North Africa. When Augustine dies in 430 AD, the Vandals are outside the gates of Hippo. Hippo is besieged. So it's easy to remember both when the Vandals are conquering Africa and also when Augustine dies. Augustine seems clearly to have been the minister of a minority congregation all his life in Africa. And one of the reasons why he was so willing to debate publicly in Africa against these people is that he was a member of a minority group, and the guy who's behind is always happier to debate than the guy who's ahead, because the guy who's behind is has nothing to lose. Augustine was very eager to get out there and confront people publicly, partly because he had a tiny group of very convinced adherents, but he wasn't going to lose anybody by doing badly in the debate because he didn't have anybody anyway, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. Augustine he does have the approval of the central government, but he doesn't have the weight of the population with him. I knew a man who was an ordinand for the Roman Catholic diocese in northern Alabama, not southern, northern Alabama. And I said, he was at Harvard Divinity School when I was there, and I said, what's it like? I mean, there we were in Boston where everybody was Catholic. And he said he would get in the car with his bishop at the bishop's, cathedral, which was about, the size of a small parish church. He said, and we'd drive 8 hours to the next parish church. We in the province are used to that, but Roman Catholics aren't used to that. And that's the kind of, I mention this because he was the first person who ever said to me, I really feel a kinship to Augustine because he was a Catholic in a non-Catholic world, and I'm a Catholic in northern Alabama in a non-Catholic world. And I said, well, what's it like being here in Boston? He said, it's like being in Italy. It's very different. Okay. Number 170, Donatist sacraments valid but not efficacious. It is in dialogue with the Donatists that Augustine works out what becomes the Western Christian basic picture of the church. Augustine argues, this is where our ecclesiology comes from. Augustine argues that essentially, on the truest level, the church is a spiritual organization, and that sacraments do not belong. The Donatists' main objection was that inappropriate people were accepted as ministers in the Catholic Church, so therefore their sacraments were invalid. And Augustine said sacraments do not belong to the person who is performing them, nor do they belong to the congregation who is performing them. Sacraments belong to Jesus Christ. And that anyone who has say the sacrament of baptism performed properly for him by anyone at all, a lay person as well as an ordained person, is baptized into the Church of Christ. It doesn't matter whether or not the person who does that for you is a saint or even a Christian. This was standard belief, but Augustine says, what does this really mean? It means that the reality is spiritual and the physical level is necessary but is not the core of what's going on. So Augustine says if the Catholic Church, for example, takes people who are baptized in the Donatist Church and they come to the Catholic Church to be accepted, they should not be rebaptized because they have been validly baptized but not effectively baptized. Their baptism becomes effective when they join the actual church. And that dual level of practical level and spiritual level has been a basic of ecclesiology in the West ever since. There's a lot more of this going on. This is where, for example, our idea of the intention of the celebrant of a Mass comes from. And this is true in all Western churches, right? If the priest gets up to celebrate the Mass and he's going through and he makes a mistake, right? If you have an idea that on the physical level everything about the sacrament has to be perfect, which is the old Roman pagan idea, then the entire service would have to be redone because it wasn't done correctly. But the Catholic Christian Western idea, and the Greeks would agree with this, from Augustine is very explicit with this. The spiritual intention of the person being correct, a desire to properly celebrate the Eucharist, minor mistakes along the way. You can't leave out the Eucharistic prayer, for example. You can't forget to hand out the bread and wine after it's consecrated. Everybody did, you don't get communion if you don't get bread and wine. But if you stumble over the words, or if you make a small mistake, along the way, that doesn't affect what's going on because it doesn't affect your intention. It doesn't affect spiritual reality. So Augustine's ecclesiology and Augustine's sacramental theology are very closely intertwined, and they have become the way of thinking of worship and sacraments in the Western Church. When Protestants are responding to Catholic thought, they're responding to Augustine, usually using other parts of Augustine to do it with. It's very important to see that. Most of these ideas are not new from him, but he puts them forward, and of course, because he and his writings are so well known, his expressions of these ideas become the standard expressions. So in the old handbooks and in the the sort of places where you look up a definition, it's Augustine's words that tend to be the definitions of all these things. So this is one of the ways in which Augustine is overwhelmingly influential. Not necessarily that he's pushing different content than other people, but his words become the words that people use to think about these things and use to express these ideas. I hope that was clear. It's one of the reasons that we've just been reading systematic theology textbooks looking for a particular book to teach dogmatics for people who are studying for the priesthood. And one of the things we have realized is very hard to find a one-volume systematic theology book, just by the way. But one of the things we have seen, I think I have seen in doing this, is that talking about ecclesiology or talking about sacraments, a well-instructed Calvinist will say almost all of the same things that a well-instructed Catholic will say. They will get to a certain point and they will stop, and the Catholic will go farther. But the basic ideas and the basic premises all come from Augustine. Everybody's starting from the same point of view. And it may well be that the Catholics are taught explicitly that they're getting it from Augustine and the Calvinists aren't, but everybody's ideas are actually coming from the same place. This is one of the ways that Augustine is the fountainhead of Western theology. Okay, just a few more things. We only have 3 more minutes. 178 is talking about the city of God versus the earthly city. Essentially, it's God's kingdom in heaven and Rome's kingdom on earth. The contrast there. The city of God comes directly out of the great emotional shock in Western Roman culture when Rome falls in the early 400s. And Augustine writes the book The City of God as a response to that shock. It's essentially a reworking of the history of Rome to show that the problem with Rome was not what a lot of people said, was that there were too many Christians and so the empire fell because the gods were displeased, but rather the empire fell because it was not Christian enough. And the real empire, anyway, is not in this world. The real empire is the kingdom in heaven. Those of us who belong to a communion called Christ the King, we have bought into that, and that's very much an Augustinian idea that is present in our very name, which is interesting. This concept of freedom, this is one of the passages, 181 on page 269. This is one of the many passages where he talks about the intertwining of the effects of the fall on human freedom and God's grace and our exercise of human freedom. Augustine wrote over and over about this. If you turn over the next page to 182 on page 270, this is Pelagius writing and being quoted by Augustine in a work on grace. You can see that Pelagius wants to imagine the power of action as residing in the human being, and Augustine teaches the church to think of the power of action residing in the grace of God. The truth is, if you're one of those people who you're going to do this grace and free will, grace and nature thing, if you read all of the many works where this comes up in Augustine from the beginning of his life to the end, his position changes drastically over time. In about the middle of his life, he is expressing what will become standard Christian doctrine, but he really goes he goes to the what we would call Calvinist extreme of sort of double predestination, which is an Augustinian teaching which the church never accepted, but which, to a certain degree, the culture seems to have. If you want to read a book, that expresses Augustine's teaching on grace and free will in the form in which it's accepted by the church, he wrote a treatise called On Nature and Grace, which is right about in the middle of his life. And that's one that you should turn to for a look at what the church takes from Augustine rather than where Augustine himself ended up. So we're almost done. More canons on sin and grace in number 186 and 187. Here it is on nature and grace. This has been translated into English with very good notes in the Library of Christian Classics series in English, and of course it will also be in that New City Press version of Augustine, which is doing everything. His work on nature and grace really is a beautiful treatise, and if you read that, you will get a sense of Augustine before the church thinks he goes too far, in his desire to have God be controlling everything. Here, give me another minute. Augustine's personal experience seems to have been that he resisted being converted, and finally the grace of God overwhelmed him, which may very well have happened. I mean, I certainly don't know. But if it did happen that way, where he was sort of consciously resisted and washed over by a wave of grace, that doesn't seem to represent the way it works for everybody. But like a lot of people, Augustine extrapolated from his own personal experience, and by making his own what seems to have been quite extreme experience of grace and human resistance to grace into the model for how things work, Augustine seems to have pointed the church off in a direction that wasn't as helpful on that central thing as he could have been. But if you remember that this is all the result of an honest expression of the fruits of his reflection on his own experience, as far as that goes, it's hard to fault him for it. And the church never accepted his most extreme teachings in this regard, but accepts him as an example of sanctity and of someone who is trying to use his tremendous intellect to the service of the church and the service of the gospel. It's hard to argue with any of that. If only all of us were able to be such good servants of the church, then wouldn't the world be a better place to live in? So that's a good place to end with Augustine. We have a few more weeks. I will not be in contact with you all until a week from now, as I will go away for a child's college graduation. So thank you for coming.